The harsh dawn of medieval life. The first light of dawn in the medieval ages did not bring peace. It brought struggle. As the pale sun crept over the misty fields, peasants, their hands cracked and calloused, were already awake. The world around them was ruthless, a place where life was cheap, disease was everywhere, and survival was the only purpose. The medieval world was not the romantic kingdom of fairy tales. It was a harsh and unforgiving era where power meant life, and weakness often led to death. The common man lived in the shadow of castles, massive stone fortresses that symbolized power and control. Inside, the lords and knights feasted, while beyond the castle walls, the peasants toiled endlessly, bound by duty and fear. Life was dictated by hierarchy. You were born into your fate. If you were a peasant, you would die a peasant. There was no escape, only endurance. The air of a medieval village carried the heavy scent of smoke, mud, and sweat. The narrow streets were unpaved, filled with filth, and animals roamed freely. Houses were simple, made of wood and straw, offering little protection from the cold. In winter, frost would creep through the cracks, freezing both body and spirit. Families huddled together, sharing warmth and fear. Hunger was a constant companion, and disease was an invisible predator that struck without mercy. For the poor, every day began before sunrise. Men worked the Lord's fields, plowing and sowing grain that they would never own. Women fetched water, cooked coarse bread, and tended to children who rarely lived to adulthood. Life expectancy was short. A man of 40 was already considered old. Every cough could mean sickness, every wound could mean death. The world was unforgiving, and those who survived did so through sheer will. Religion was the only light in the darkness. The church towered over every village, not only as a place of worship but as a reminder that even in suffering, people were told to find meaning. Priests preached that hardship was the will of God, that poverty was a test of faith, and so the people endured, praying for mercy in a world that offered none. Bells rang each morning, calling souls to prayer, while plagues crept silently through the same streets. War was never far away. Lords and kings fought over land and pride, sending young men to die in fields far from home. The clang of steel and the screams of the dying became the background music of the era. Villages were burned, crops stolen, and families scattered. Knights, the armored warriors of their time, were both protectors and oppressors. They served their lords with loyalty, but ruled over peasants with iron fists. For every noble's victory, countless commoners paid the price. In towns, life was no kinder. Markets were filled with noise, barter, and desperation. Merchants struggled to survive as guilds controlled trade. The poor begged on the streets, hoping for a coin or a crust of bread. Criminals were punished brutally. Thieves had their hands cut off, and traitors were hanged in the public square. Justice in the medieval world was not about fairness, it was about fear. The plague, the Black Death, would later sweep across Europe like a dark storm, killing millions and erasing entire villages from existence. But even before that catastrophe, disease was always near. Rats infested homes, water was polluted, and medicine was almost non-existent. Doctors relied on superstition and prayer, while barbers doubled as surgeons. Bloodletting, leeches, and herbal mixtures were the closest things to treatment. Survival often depended on luck more than skill. For women, life was even more limited. Their roles were bound by duty to their husbands, their children, and their faith. Marriage was rarely about love, it was about survival and status. Girls were married young, often at 12 or 13, their futures decided by others. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women died bringing life into a world that took it so easily. Yet even in silence, women played a vital role holding families and communities together in the face of endless struggle. Children were not spared from hardship. From the moment they could walk, they worked. There was no childhood as we understand it today. They helped in the fields, tended animals, or learned trades from their fathers. Education was rare, reserved for the wealthy or the clergy. For most, knowledge was passed down by word of mouth, through stories and survival lessons learned in the dirt and blood of daily life. Nights in the medieval ages were long and filled with fear. Without light, the darkness belonged to wolves, thieves, and superstition. People locked their doors early, praying for safety. The howls of animals mixed with the distant sounds of suffering. Candles flickered inside homes, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. In this world, fear was not an emotion, it was a way of life. Yet even in this ruthless existence, the human spirit refused to die. There were moments of laughter around the hearth, songs sung at harvest festivals, and hope whispered in the prayers of mothers. The people of the medieval ages were survivors, hardened by pain but bound by community. They lived not because life was kind, but because they had no other choice. Survival was not just an instinct, it was their destiny. As the first part of this brutal journey closes, one thing becomes clear. Life in the medieval ages was a battle fought every single day against hunger, against disease, against oppression, and against time itself. Every sunrise was both a blessing and a curse, a reminder that to live in this world was to fight endlessly for the right to see another dawn, the lords, the knights, and the chains of power. In the ruthless world of the medieval ages, power was everything, and it belonged to the few. Above the starving peasants and struggling villagers stood the lords and knights, men who ruled not only with swords, but with fear. Their castles rose high above the land, cold stone giants watching over the people below, not to protect them, but to remind them who held control. The feudal system was the backbone of medieval life, a brutal hierarchy where everyone had their place, and stepping out of it meant death. The king sat at the top, a distant figure whose will shaped the fate of thousands. Below him were the nobles and barons, the lords of the land, each controlling vast territories. Beneath them were the knights, trained warriors sworn to defend their lord's honor. And at the very bottom, crushed under the weight of power, were the serfs, the peasants who worked the fields, built the walls, and paid the price for everyone above them. A serf was not a free man. He was born on his lord's land, tied to it by law and by duty. His children would inherit the same bondage, serving the same master until death. Every crop he grew, every piece of bread he baked, a part of it belonged to his lord. And if the harvest failed, if the weather turned cruel, the lord still demanded his share. The people endured famine while the nobles feasted inside stone halls lit by torchlight and echoing with laughter. Inside the castle, life was a world apart. The lords lived in relative comfort, surrounded by servants and guarded by armored knights. Yet even within these thick stone walls, fear lingered. Betrayal was common, alliances shifted like sand, and a wrong word could lead to execution. The throne room was a place of false smiles and hidden daggers. The medieval world's politics were as brutal as its wars. Knights, on the other hand, lived by the code of chivalry, or so they claimed. In truth, many knights were mercenaries, soldiers of fortune who killed, looted, and burned in the name of honor. They trained from childhood, learning to wield swords heavier than a man's arm. Their armor gleamed in the sun, symbols of strength and dominance. But behind the shining steel were men molded by violence. They were both heroes and monsters, protectors and destroyers, loyal yet feared. A knight's loyalty belonged not to morality, but to his lord. When the trumpet sounded and banners rose, they rode into battle without question. They fought for land that was not theirs, for wealth they would never see, and for kings who barely knew their names. Blood stained the soil, villages burned, and survivors wept in the ashes. All for the ambitions of men who sat on golden thrones. Wars between rival lords were frequent and devastating. One man's pride could destroy 100 lives. Armies of knights, foot soldiers, and archers clashed in open fields, while peasants hid in forests, praying to survive. The clang of swords, the thunder of horses, and the screams of the dying filled the air. When the battle ended, the land was left in ruin, homes destroyed, fields trampled, bodies scattered. But war did not end suffering, it only reset it. Beyond the battlefield, the Lord's rule was absolute. They collected taxes, decided justice, and controlled every aspect of life on their land. A peasant could be punished, imprisoned, or even executed on a lord's command. Justice had no mercy. It served only the powerful. The gallows stood in the village square, a grim reminder of what happened to those who dared to resist. In many ways, the castle itself was a symbol of oppression. Its walls were high not to keep enemies out, but to keep fear in. From its towers, the Lord could see everything he owned: the fields, the rivers, the people. He was the law, the ruler, and sometimes the executioner. Inside the great hall, under banners and candlelight, decisions were made that shaped the lives of thousands. But the voices of the poor were never heard. Knighthood, despite its honor, was not all glory. To become a knight required wealth, training, and lineage. Only the sons of nobles could dream of wearing armor. Common men, no matter how brave, would never be allowed to rise above their place. The system was built to keep power in the hands of a few, while the rest of humanity struggled beneath it. And yet, even in this web of power and pain, there were cracks. Some knights grew weary of blind loyalty, questioning the righteousness of endless wars. Others defied their lords, becoming outlaws and rebels, hunted but free. In hidden forests, groups of bandits attacked caravans and nobles, redistributing stolen goods to the poor. To the ruling class, they were criminals. To the starving villagers, they were heroes. The church, too, held immense power during this time, often equal to or greater than the king himself. Priests and bishops lived like nobles, collecting tithes from the poor and enforcing obedience through fear of damnation. The people were told that defying their Lord was defying God. Faith was weaponized. Salvation became a tool of control. Still, many clung to religion sincerely, finding comfort in the promise of heaven when life on earth was nothing but misery. While the powerful ruled and the weak obeyed, a silent hatred brewed beneath the surface. In taverns and huts, whispers of rebellion spread. Men and women dreamed of freedom, of a life where their sweat and blood might belong to them. But rebellion was a death sentence. The feudal world was built to crush resistance, and it did so mercilessly. Each passing century deepened the divide between ruler and ruled. Castles grew stronger, taxes heavier, and the peasants more desperate. Power in the medieval ages was not earned through goodness or wisdom. It was seized through strength and maintained through fear. The world was a giant chain, forged by violence, linking master to servant, noble to peasant, knight to king. And still, life went on. The peasants continued to till the land, the knights continued to fight, and the lords continued to rule. This was survival, not through fairness or justice, but through sheer endurance. Those who lived long enough to see peace did not celebrate. They simply waited for the next storm. In this ruthless hierarchy, mercy was a weakness, and loyalty was often a curse. The people of the medieval ages did not live for glory. They lived to survive another day under the crushing weight of power, the plague, the hunger, and the endless darkness. The medieval ages were not just defined by the sword and the crown. They were defined by suffering. It was a world where every breath was uncertain, every day a struggle, and every night filled with dread. The greatest enemies of mankind were not just kings and wars, they were famine, disease, and death itself. By the mid-14th century, the world faced a terror that no sword could stop: the Black Death. It came silently, creeping from the ports and trade routes, carried by rats and the fleas that lived on them. No one knew what it was, where it came from, or how to escape it. Within months, it spread like wildfire through towns and villages, turning the once busy streets into silent graveyards. The symptoms were horrifying: black boils, fevers, uncontrollable bleeding, and madness. People died within days, sometimes hours. Entire families were wiped out before sunrise, bodies piled in the streets, too many to bury. The air was thick with the stench of death. Churches overflowed with the dying, and even priests refused to give last rites. Fear ruled every heart. In the beginning, people turned to faith. They prayed, begged, and offered sacrifices, hoping for mercy. But when the prayers failed, faith turned into panic. Some believed it was God's punishment for humanity's sins. Others blamed strangers, travelers, or those who looked different. The streets saw mobs and massacres as people desperately searched for someone to blame. In towns, the once lively markets were abandoned. Merchants closed their doors, fearing infection. The cries of children echoed through the empty alleys, calling for mothers who would never answer. The living stopped caring for the dead, and soon the living envied them. But disease was not the only killer. Hunger was a constant companion long before and after the plague. Crop failures, harsh winters, and endless wars left the land barren. In villages, food was more precious than gold. Bread was thin, soups were made from weeds, and people ate whatever they could find: rats, dogs, and even bark from trees. Famine twisted the human spirit, turning kindness into desperation. Mothers watched their children starve, powerless to help. For the peasants, the struggle never ended. They worked in fields drained of life, their backs bent from sunrise to sunset, only to watch the harvest rot from disease or theft. The Lord still demanded their share, even when there was nothing left to give. Refusal meant punishment, often death. The cruel irony of the medieval world was that those who fed it were always the ones who starved. In the cities, disease and hunger combined into one endless nightmare. The streets were narrow, filthy, and overcrowded. Human waste ran through the gutters, rats swarmed everywhere, and clean water was a luxury few could afford. Illness spread fast, not just the plague, but fevers, dysentery, and countless, unnamed sicknesses. Every cough could be a death sentence. Medicine, as it was known then, was little more than superstition. Doctors wore bird-like masks filled with herbs, believing the scent would protect them from infection. They spoke of bad air, evil spirits, and divine wrath. But they had no cure. Treatments were often worse than the sickness: bloodletting, burning wounds, and potions made from mercury or ground bones. For the poor, there were no doctors at all, only prayer. As the years passed, death became a part of life. Children played near cemeteries, People laughed and wept in the same breath. Survival was no longer about living. It was about not dying today. The medieval world had no comfort, no safety, no guarantee of tomorrow. At night, darkness swallowed the land. Candles flickered weakly, unable to pierce the endless black. Wolves howled from the forests, their cries mixing with the groans of the sick. The world felt cursed, forgotten by heaven itself. Many believed the end of days had come, that humanity was being cleansed by divine fire. In some places, entire villages vanished. Doors stood open, food rotted on tables, and silence ruled. Travelers spoke of ghost towns where not a single soul remained. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky lingered, alone, haunted by the sound of their own heartbeat. And yet, even in the face of endless darkness, humanity refused to vanish. The survivors, those who crawled out of the ruins, began to rebuild piece by piece. They buried their dead, cleaned their streets, and tried to forget the horror that had passed. Life continued, but the scars never faded. Every survivor carried the weight of memories, of hunger, of loss, of the smell of death in every corner. The Black Death had changed everything. With millions gone, villages empty, and fields untended, the balance of power began to shift. The peasants, once voiceless, began to realize their worth. Lords could no longer control land without workers. For the first time in centuries, the powerless had a choice: to demand more, to move, to survive on their own terms. But the medieval world was not ready to give up its cruelty. New rulers rose, new wars began, and the same cycle of suffering continued. Disease, famine, and death were no longer strangers. They were part of life itself. The people of the medieval ages did not dream of glory or comfort. They dreamed only of survival, of waking up to another sunrise, of hearing their children's laughter, of tasting bread one more time. Their world was merciless, their gods silent, and their rulers cruel. But their will to live was unbreakable. In the end, it was not the knights or kings who truly embodied the medieval age. It was the survivors, the peasants, the mothers, the nameless men and women who fought every day against the darkness that tried to consume them. The faith, the fire, and the shadow of fear. Faith was the heartbeat of the medieval world. And yet it was also one of its greatest prisons. In a ruthless age where war, hunger, and disease ruled the land, religion was the one power that promised meaning in suffering. The church stood above kings, above law, and above the common man. It was the unshakable pillar of belief. But behind its holy walls, there lurked fear, fire, and control. Every village had its church, every town its cathedral, towering monuments of stone reaching toward the heavens. Bells rang at dawn and dusk, calling people to prayer, reminding them that no matter how miserable their lives were, they must remain obedient. The church promised salvation, but it demanded loyalty, submission, and unquestioning faith. Priests preached that every misfortune, plague, famine, or loss was punishment for sin, and so people blamed themselves for their misery. The poor bowed their heads, confessed their sins, and begged for forgiveness. They gave what little they had, grain, coins, even labor, to the church, believing it would buy them a place in heaven. But not all faith was pure. The church was rich, richer than any king. Gold lined its altars, bishops wore jewels, and the poor who built those cathedrals often died nameless and forgotten. The very institution that preached humility lived in luxury, feeding on the fear of the masses. Religion became power, and power in the medieval ages was rarely merciful. When the world turned dark, people turned desperate. Strange things began to happen. Whispers of witchcraft, heresy, and devilry spread like smoke through the villages. Whenever misfortune struck, a sick child, a dead cow, a bad harvest, someone had to be blamed, and often that someone was a woman. The witch hunts began slowly, a murmur here, a rumor there, but they grew into an inferno of paranoia. Old widows, midwives, healers, or anyone who lived differently became targets. If a woman spoke her mind, if she gathered herbs, if she simply looked the wrong way, she was accused of witchcraft. Fear consumed reason. Accusation meant death. The accused were dragged before priests and judges, often tortured until they confessed. Fire became the church's answer to sin. The pyres burned day and night, filling the air with the scent of charred flesh and screams. Villagers watched in silence, too afraid to speak. They told themselves it was justice, but deep down, they knew it was madness. These witch hunts were not just about religion, they were about control. By keeping people afraid, the powerful stayed in power. The church ruled not only through faith, but through terror. People feared hell, but they feared the church's wrath even more. And so, they obeyed. They prayed harder, confessed deeper, and surrendered their will. Even knowledge became dangerous. Scholars who questioned church teachings risked their lives. Books were banned, ideas were buried, and science was labeled heresy. Men who dared to say the earth moved around the sun were imprisoned or burned. The pursuit of truth was silenced beneath the roar of faith. The Inquisition, the church's weapon of judgment, swept through Europe like a shadow. Its agents searched for heretics, tortured them, and forced them to repent. Dungeons beneath cathedrals became chambers of horror. Iron chains, racks, and fire were the tools of salvation. They called it purification, but it was fear, wrapped in the language of God. Ordinary people lived in constant dread, not of war or plague, but of accusation. A single word from a neighbor could mean imprisonment or death. Families turned against one another. Silence became safety. And yet, even in this suffocating fear, faith remained. People still prayed, still clung to the belief that beyond all this cruelty, heaven awaited. In monasteries and abbeys, there were also those who tried to preserve what little goodness remained. Monks copied ancient manuscripts, saved forgotten knowledge, and tended to the sick when no one else dared. There were priests who truly believed in compassion, who gave food to the hungry and shelter to the lost. But their kindness was drowned out by the roaring fire of fanaticism that consumed the era. The world was trapped between belief and brutality. Faith gave comfort, but it also enslaved. The church's light illuminated hope and cast long shadows of fear. Every sermon reminded people that their lives were temporary, their suffering divine, and their salvation uncertain. To question was to sin. To rebel was to die. At night, as the bells tolled and smoke rose from the burning stakes, the people of the medieval ages looked to the sky and wondered if God truly saw them. Was their pain part of a divine plan? Or had the world simply gone mad? They had no answers, only endurance. The fire burned not just in the pyres, but in their hearts. The fire of belief, of guilt, of survival. It was this fire that kept them alive through the cold nights and endless fear. Because in this ruthless world, faith, no matter how twisted, was sometimes the only thing they had left. The fall of the old world and the rise of hope. For centuries, the medieval world had been drowned in darkness, ruled by fear, hunger, and the iron grip of power. The peasants had toiled under merciless lords, the poor had bowed to the church, and disease had swept through the land like an invisible army. But even the harshest night must one day end. Slowly, painfully, the first light of change began to pierce through the shadows. By the late Middle Ages, the old world was beginning to crack. The Black Death had killed millions, but it had also changed everything. With so many dead, the balance of power began to shift. There were fewer workers, and that gave the survivors leverage. Peasants who had once been bound to the land began to demand better pay, fairer treatment, and freedom. Some fled their lords entirely, seeking new lives in growing towns and cities. The feudal system, which had chained humanity for centuries, began to weaken. Lords could no longer control what they did not have the strength to maintain. Castles that once ruled the countryside began to crumble, and new centers of life rose, bustling marketplaces, guilds, and towns filled with free men and women. The idea of freedom, once unthinkable, started to take root. Trade routes reopened, and ships once again sailed across seas that had fallen silent. The world grew larger. Merchants traveled from distant lands, bringing silk from the East, spices from Arabia, and new ideas from every corner of the known world. The medieval isolation began to fade. People started to see beyond their villages and their fears. The hunger for survival slowly turned into a hunger for knowledge. The church still held great power, but even that was being questioned. The endless wars, the corruption, and the cruelty of the witch hunts had left deep scars. People began to ask dangerous questions. Was this truly the will of God? Why should salvation cost gold? Why should one man decide another's soul? These whispers would one day ignite a revolution, the beginning of reform, of faith reclaimed by the people. In towns and cities, new voices began to rise. Scholars, thinkers, and artists who dared to dream beyond the darkness. Knowledge, once chained in monasteries, began to flow again. Books were copied and shared. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman wisdom sparked a new fire in the human spirit. It was the birth of the Renaissance, a time when light returned to the world. Art began to bloom where ashes once lay. Painters, sculptors, and poets found beauty in the human form, in nature, and in life itself. Science began to challenge superstition. The stars were no longer seen as omens, but as mysteries to be understood. For the first time, humanity began to believe that knowledge, not fear, could guide their future. Still, the scars of the old world remained. Many clung to the past, afraid of change. Wars continued, famines still struck, and injustice did not vanish overnight. But the difference was that now people believed change was possible. Hope had been reborn, fragile but real. For the peasants who once bowed before their lords, hope meant owning a small piece of land. For the craftsmen, it meant building a name through skill rather than bloodline. For the thinkers and dreamers, it meant freedom, the right to question, to explore, to imagine. The medieval world, once defined by survival, was slowly giving birth to something new: progress. The fire that once burned villages was now lighting the lamps of knowledge. The swords that once spilled blood were now forged into tools. The same hands that once buried the dead were now building cities that reached for the sky. And yet, the lesson of the medieval ages would never be forgotten. Humanity had seen what it meant to live without compassion, to suffer under the weight of power and ignorance. The survivors had paid dearly for the world's rebirth. But because of them, future generations would live in a world less cruel, less blind. As the last echoes of the Middle Ages faded into history, a new world emerged, one filled with both promise and peril. The darkness had not vanished completely, but it no longer ruled unchallenged. The people of Europe, scarred and hardened by centuries of struggle, began to walk toward a dawn they had never dared to dream of. The story of the medieval ages is not just one of death and despair. It is the story of endurance. It is about men and women who lived through unthinkable hardship and still found ways to love, to hope, to believe. It is about the strength of the human spirit, the one thing that even a ruthless world could not destroy. When we look back at that brutal time, we see more than castles and kings. We see survival. We see the birth of resilience. The peasants who fought hunger, the mothers who buried their children yet kept living, the healers who risked their lives to help others, the thinkers who refused to be silenced. They were the foundation of everything that came after. The medieval ages may have been a world of shadows, but from those shadows rose the light of civilization itself. The survivors of that ruthless age did not just endure, they built the bridge to the modern world. And so, the story ends where it began, with life. Harsh, fragile, beautiful life. Surviving, evolving, and rising again from the ashes of suffering. The medieval ages were a time of darkness, yes, but also a testament to humanity's unbreakable will to survive. The end.